Well, can I say welcome to this, one of our many Friday lunch things I think will take place. The purpose is to try and increase our understanding, our mutual understanding of matter, and it's not always going to be product related, and it's not always going to be company related, but I'd like to think we could introduce other topics that would be interesting and growing. You know, there's a suggestion that you can be old at 30 or young at 90, and the proposition is that if you keep learning, you'll remain young. And I don't know whether this particular session is going to take you through to 90, but it'll start on the path at least. The topic we're going to discuss today is called weaves, what and why. And we'll approach this from a furnishing perspective, because that's obviously the business we're in, and I'll also approach it even more specifically from a materialised furnishing perspective, because it's a big topic and it's not something we really can cover in 10 or 15 minutes, but we can start. And so what if I could get you to turn on to the three topics, or the three kinds of conventional base cloths on which we normally print are either twill, satins or plains. And the topics we're going to discuss today about the weave is the construction of the weave and also the yarn that's involved in it, because they're the two sort of critical ingredients. Just to sort of set the basis, a woven fabric is one where the warp yarn, which is this black yarn in this case, it runs the length of the machinery, and the weft yarn, which is in this case the white yarn, it's going across the loom. So we'll just keep talking about warps and wefts, and I'll remind you through the course of the conversation which is which, just in case we forget it. We can move on. We'll deal firstly with a plain weave. And one of the characteristics of a plain weave is that it's uniform in weave, and so you'll see with this little pink one on the side there that there's a regularity about the construction of the cloth, so that the warp and the weft interchange at regular intervals, at regular one at a time type intervals. The confusing factor is that you can have a very heavy weft, for example, with a very light warp, and it'll look quite different to a square weave, but nonetheless it's a square weave. And one of the features about a square weave is that it fairly evenly distributes the wear load. So if you have a close look at any of the weaves now, for instance, I think the nearest thing we've got to a square weave would be Fabrelon or linen, zircon, that sorts of things. And because the warp and the weft are equally exposed, the abrasion on those yarns is fairly evenly distributed, so it gives it a good resistance to abrasion. And also you'll see there that it has an evenness that doesn't make it that easy for the thing to snag. And that's another consideration in furnishings. As much as things like draperies, it's not a big issue, but certainly with bedspreads and upholstery, if the longer the exposed float, and we'll perhaps go on to the next topic of a twill that example is a little easier to understand. In a twill, the yarn in the warp jumps two weft yarns, if you can see that there. And here you can see that it forms like a diagonal effect in the thing. And what I was saying before is that the length of this float tends to determine how vulnerable it is to snagging. So that if you get a longer thread or a longer yarn exposed to the surface without any support, it's going to give you greater potential to snag. It'll also mean that yarn on the top, this one here for example, that's sitting above two weft yarns, will be more prone to abrasion and so forth. But again, you'll see this sort of weave in many styles. You'll find that the nature of the yarn that's used and the texture of the yarn and so forth, and whether the warp is consistent in terms of size to the weft will also change the look of it. And the reason you'd use a twill is because of the nature of its weave, it tends to drape a little more easily than a square weave. If you can sort of picture square weaves, this is a fairly general statement, but assume it's a bit like a canvas, it doesn't drape as nicely as a satin, and that's why bridal satins are like that. And we'll get to satins in a moment. Perhaps we could turn on to a satin now. You'll see here, a satin's defined by the warp yarn jumping about, in this case, 5 weft yarns. So you've got an awful lot of warp yarn on the surface, and that can give you a very smooth cloth, and it gives you very nice draping capabilities. And I've got an example here. Our Midnight, for example, is a very good satin. It drapes superbly, but can I tell you the downside with it is that those, in order to conceal the weft, which in this case is black, you can see that there's a black yarn tucked in there, which is the weft yarn, and the warp yarn in this case is a beigey sort of colour. And that warp yarn is so dense and it's so packed and there's so much of it on the surface that you really don't see the black at all. It has a tiny little sort of greying effect. And so that would be the sort of reason you'd use a satin in a drapery particularly, but I'd be very sceptical about using a cloth like this, for instance, as a bedspread, because you only need, particularly in the business we're in, you only need somebody to turn up with their suitcase that's just arrived from Bombay and it's got a couple of rough edges on it and throw it on the bed and you've got a snag on your hand. So there are those things to consider, but as a bed skirt, as a drapery, as a helmet or any of those sort of things, even as a cushion, it feels nice, but it's got this propensity to snag. So that's satins. Perhaps if we could go on. This is a very early Dobby loom, and these cloths that we've just been speaking about, the square weave and the twill and the satin, are woven on a loom that's very predictable. So that these warp controlling heddles
and shafts, yeah,
are very structured, and they'll sort of open the warp up in a particular way, and the weft will be inserted, and then they'll close and they'll open up in another way. But a very limited range of options, so that it's either up or down.
Correct.
And they're called dobbies, and dobby weaving has been around forever and a day. In this case, it's a hand loom, and I just thought you'd find it interesting as a picture. Of course, nowadays they're much more sophisticated. They in fact in many cases, throw the weft yarn across on a jet of water, or use a rapier, or by air. And for instance, to go into a Korean shear weaving organisation, you're sort of up to your ankles in water because they're spitting the yarn across those very fine yarns, and it enables them to do some wonderfully refined fabrics, but all in the very same principle as this thing here, which is, I don't know, dates back to whenever they started, I think just a little bit after Eve was using the leaf. So if we could... And then come along Jacquard. That was a man, and he was a Frenchman from Lyon in France, and he invented a device that enabled that configuration of the heddle to be managed. And what he did it with, and if you can just pick through this, it's actually in the notes, and I'll hand them out to you in a little while. It's like a pianola roll, and it's actually telling each and every one of those heddles when to open and when to close, and it enabled the world to start weaving things like this, a pattern and shapes and different motifs into fabric that were previously unavailable. The sort of things that you'd have to do in order to get this sort of effect would be to, say, dye the yarn in a very sort of controlled way and then position it and so forth to get colour variance, but you never actually got textural variance. It was always a very flat woven thing. So this is a really... This was a great advancement in the textile industry. This is a picture of a more modern Jacquard loom, and that other one, I was having a little difficulty finding one that was of Jacquard's era, but here you'll see these are now computer controlled, and every one of these heddle
tubes.
Are they tubes?
Yeah, the tubes. They can, each one controls an end.
Holds the yarn that's forming the warp there individually, so you could actually lift one and not the other 950,000 across the cloth and so forth. So it gives you an immense variety of choices.